Hello everyone, I hope you're doing well. Today I'm going to be filming my favorite and least favorite horror movies of 2019, and I don't know about you guys, but I think that 2019 was actually a really wonderful year for horror movies. I think there are a lot of directors we love who had maybe their first movie that came out in 2017 or 2018, and 2019 was their second kind of big film we were all excited about. I've said in the past I didn't love 2019 that much, and that is true, but at least it was a really good year for horror. I also down the road want to film movies and TV shows that are horror thriller related that come out in 2020, so if there are any that you're looking forward to, let me know. I know at least right now one I'm already loving is The Outsider on HBO, and if you're not watching it, you need to immediately. But anyway, we're not here to talk about The Outsider as much as I want to. Normally I just talk about favorites and least favorites in kind of big chunks, but I am going to talk about my top 5 and bottom 5 from 5 up to number 1, and let's start off with my least favorites. I am going to say up front, I'm not apologizing for disliking any of these. You guys know I don't really do disclaimers, but I will say that most of these aren't terrible. It's more that I was just really looking forward to these and then was really disappointed personally. I'm not going to waste my time watching something like, what was that movie, The Haunting of Sharon Tate? So let's start off with number 5. At number 5 we have Velvet Buzzsaw, and this was directed by Dan Gilroy. He created my favorite movie of all time. Well, that's a big statement. One of at least I would say my top 5, which is Nightcrawler. I also have a bit of an obsession with Jake Gyllenhaal. Who doesn't? So I was really looking forward to this and was pretty let down. I will say this isn't my number 1 least favorite. It's only at number 5 because I did find it really entertaining. It's about a woman who's an art dealer. Her neighbor passes away, so she finds these paintings and starts to sell them, and then people start dying left and right. Now I did find this really entertaining. I liked learning about the Miami art scene, but just because Nightcrawler was such a favorite of mine, I find myself continually a little bit let down by most movies and things he's created since then. I was not remotely scared at any point during this movie, so overall was not a fan of Velvet Buzzsaw. At number 4 is Chambers. This is a horror TV show, and it's a very stereotypical plot, which is another reason I didn't like it, where someone gets someone else's body part. A young teenager gets the heart of a rich girl who passed away, and not surprisingly, when she gets her heart, she starts seeing things. This was maybe the most boring TV show I've ever seen. About however long it is, I got about 3/4 of the way through, and I was so incredibly bored. There is good slow-paced horror. This was not it. At number 3 is Wounds. And although this wasn't a horror movie that I was really looking forward to, I just remember I was having a really bad day and I sat down, I think it was a Friday night, I had no plans and I was just feeling kind of down, and I opened Netflix and I see that there's a new horror movie, and I also have a mild obsession with Dakota Fanning and Armie Hammer. If you don't like Armie Hammer, just go watch an interview with him. He is delightful, just surprisingly like really funny and delightful, and if you don't like Dakota Fanning, go watch her Ellen interview. It's entertaining. So I was really excited to just see that this was on, and this was awful. Maybe one of the worst horror movies I've seen in the past few years. It was so bad I can't even really articulate or remember what it was about. Something to do with a cell phone and tunnels. I don't know. I don't know how this got made. I don't know what happened here, but it was a terrible mess. At number 2 is the movie adaptation of a book that I read and loved in 2019, and that is Pet Sematary. I think that the 1980s version is so much fun. This 2019 version felt so lifeless, and I didn't understand why it was made. It didn't feel like there was any heart or emotion that went into this movie. It just really felt like a cash grab. The actors were all fine and decent, but there was nothing remotely memorable, and I didn't understand what they thought they were improving upon when it came to either the book or the 1980s version. And at number 1, and I hope this doesn't upset too many people, although I don't mind if it does, and that is The Lighthouse. Now, this is not at number 1 of my least favorites because I think this is objectively a bad movie. It's at number 1 because for me personally, it was one of the horror movies. It was maybe my number 1 or number 2 that I was most anticipating for the year. And to be very blunt, about 3/4 of the way into the movie, I almost wanted to leave, and that really, really rarely happens to me in a movie theater. Now, as I said, objectively, the acting is wonderful. I love Willem Dafoe, I love Robert Pattinson, can't wait to see Batman, especially now that Colin Farrell, who is maybe my #1 obsession, is going to be, I think, play the Penguin, but anyway. The acting was fantastic, the cinematography was wonderful. A couple scenes that I did really love. Who didn't love the Willem Dafoe scene of him ranting about Robert Pattinson not liking his food? The mermaid scene I thought was terrifying, but the mermaid scream was horrifying. So there were bits and pieces of this movie that I liked, but as a whole, I thought it was incredibly repetitive. And I know that, what's his name? Chris Stuckman, I watch his movie reviews sometimes. He made a comment and he was like, this movie isn't above a fart joke. And I feel like some people found this movie funny, and believe me, I understood the aspects that were supposed to be funny. I just personally didn't find them funny. You know, Get Out and Us are horror movies where I shouldn't compare because they're so obviously different to what The Lighthouse is. Those are horror movies where I do find myself laughing and there is some lightness, but I just at the end of the day found myself incredibly bored by The Lighthouse. It felt like it was just the same scene over and over and over again. And if you're the type of person who thinks, oh, sometimes people just aren't smart enough to get a movie and that's why they didn't enjoy it, then you're not smart enough to understand that two different people can have two completely different opinions about the movie and they can both be right. The Witch is still one of my favorite horror movies of all time, so I'm still really looking forward to seeing what Robert Eggers comes out with next, but The Lighthouse was my biggest letdown of 2019. Now let's end this video on a positive note. We're going to talk about my favorite horror movies of 2019. I will say I haven't seen obviously every single one that came out. These are obviously just the ones I've seen. Starting off at #5 is Midsommar by Ari Aster. This was, I think, up there with The Lighthouse for the horror movie, the other horror movie that I was really looking forward to in 2019. And although I do think Hereditary was a better movie and I overall enjoyed Hereditary much more, Midsommar, even though it's not one of my favorite horror movies of all time, something about it just really stuck with me. And for some reason, it has really high rewatchability for me. Now it's on Amazon Prime, I think. If you guys have Prime and you haven't seen it, go for it. Maybe don't watch it with your parents. There's some scenes that would be a little awkward. But for some reason, I find myself really wanting to rewatch this movie. There's something so stunning about the way that it's filmed, and this is really about the end of a relationship. I read that the director made this movie after he had a breakup personally in his life, which makes a lot of sense if you watch it. And I will say I love Florence Pugh, but in what world, why has she been nominated for an Oscar for Little Women and not Midsommar? I understand that it's lead actress versus supporting, I get it, but in my mind this is just another time that someone hasn't been nominated because it's a horror movie, but that's a discussion for a different day. At #4 is Us. I know a lot of us were really anticipating this movie and it definitely lived up to, I want to say, most of our expectations. This would be on the list honestly alone just for the soundtrack because I listen to that all the time at work when I really want to focus on making, like when I'm in Excel or PowerPoint and I need to be working away, I will put on the Us soundtrack just on repeat. I will say I didn't love this as much as Get Out just because I didn't find the ending as satisfying, but I love how many different layers Jordan Peele's movies have, how fun it is to dissect them afterwards with your friends or just reading online. I love the blend of how horrific the things that happen with the humor, so was really pleased with Us. At #3 is a TV show, and that is Servant on Apple TV. This is created by M. Night Shyamalan, and at a high level, it's about a husband and wife living in Philadelphia, and their baby unfortunately passes away. You don't find out how until much later in the season, but they have a, what is it called, a reborn doll, and the wife, because of, you know, her psychological state, thinks this reborn doll really is her living son, Jericho. So they hire this very strange teenage nanny from Wisconsin. She appears and seems to take care of this baby as if it is real. And I won't say anything else, but it's bizarre. It leaves you guessing. Rupert Grint is so funny. He plays the uncle in this, and it's so bizarre to see him as this obnoxious, arrogant man, but he is like the comic relief. And him talking about with his sister, you know, baby names, and her saying she wants to name her son Jericho, and him saying something like, well, is Jericho the type of name that's gonna get him fucked? I died. So really disturbing. Cannot wait for season 2. And if you have not seen Servant, now is the perfect time because The whole season is done, so you can try a free trial of Apple TV and then cancel it once you finish. At number 2 is a horror movie. Well, it's not technically horror, but I think it's one that a lot of you may not have seen, and that is The Nightingale. The Nightingale is created or is directed by Jennifer Kent, who, if that sounds familiar, she was the director of The Babadook, so she is now quickly becoming one of my favorite directors of all time. This is about an Irish woman and her husband who have been sent to Australia. She is being forced to serve this horrific British, I don't know if he's a general exactly what his title is, but all I'll say is that many horrific things happen at the beginning of this movie that causes her to chase after this British general, whatever his title is, into this Australian wilderness with the help of an Indigenous man. This is one of the most difficult to watch movies I have ever seen because it is brutal with how real this feels. A big warning if you don't like to see most things. I mean, really anything you can think of. I'm struggling to come up with a list because it is incredibly brutal and hard to watch. This movie feels like a gut punch when you see the things that happen to her, her family, the Indigenous people of Australia, the man who she hires to lead her through the wilderness to chase this British general. I read that Jennifer Kent specifically wanted an Indigenous person from Australia who had never acted before. So it's really, he does an amazing job. So again, I highly recommend seeing The Nightingale. It's technically more historical fiction than horror, but believe me, it's the most horrifying thing on this entire list. It feels very strange to jump to number 2 to number 1, considering number 1 is kind of funny, but at the end of the day, this was my favorite movie of 2019, which was a surprise to me because I thought it looked kind of silly when I saw the trailer, but my number 1 favorite horror movie of 2019 is Ready or Not. Now, I do think objectively The Nightingale is a better movie than Ready or Not, so if we're just going on objectively what's the best movie on this list, I do think it's The Nightingale, and it was really hard to choose between number 2 and number 1, but when it just comes down to what movie would I want to rewatch over and over again, I've seen Ready or Not 3 times now. I'm obsessed with Samara Weaving. I think people enjoy this movie for a fun time, but I don't know if it gets enough credit for being actually as smart as it is. It really doesn't make sense to have a sequel for this movie, but it just makes me sad that Ready or Not is probably the only thing that's ever gonna exist in that universe because I want to just go back into it. I think it's just the type of movie that any person off the street and any critic would really enjoy. Those are my favorite and least favorite horror movies of 2019. Again, let me know 1, what your favorites were of 2019, and 2, I really want to hear what are you excited about in 2020 that's coming out, or what in 2020 have you already seen that you're really loving. I'm about to close this laptop and go see 1917, which I've heard, although is not a horror movie, definitely feels like one, so I'm excited to see that, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.